thumbs up. Okay, understand we're live, 7 o'clock. Gonna get started. Good to see you. Good to be with you, whether I can see you or not. I'm guessing we have a few folks who are tuned in online. And give a few shout outs here to Donna out in Colorado. She's pretty faithful about tuning in and watching us. I'm guessing Gary maybe is watching at home tonight. And Bert and Jeannie. And two of our biggest commenters, Jimmy and Renee. Hope you guys are feeling better and able to get back out here soon. But those of you that are here, it's good to see you. It's good to be back with you. Appreciate Howard and him stepping in when I haven't been able to be here over the last few weeks, sometimes on very short notice. But I'm back, and with any luck, and you can decide whether it's good luck or bad luck, you may see me several weeks in a row now. We're in the book of Acts. We're going to pick back up. Tonight we're going to look at chapter 6. Which, as I look at it, I didn't go and check, but I'm under the impression that this is maybe the shortest chapter in the book. So maybe we'll get through it tonight. Chapter 6. I am kind of convinced that chapters 6 and 7, other than the first part of chapter 6 and the last part of chapter 7, that the middle of those chapters we don't really look at in much detail, usually. We will spend time looking at the first part of chapter 6 and the selection of Stephen, and we talk about deacons, and we talk about a couple of things related to that. And we move quickly into him getting arrested and going on trial, and we kind of skip over most of his defense and get down to the end where he starts yelling at them, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised, and them dragging him out and stoning him. And we skip all that stuff in the middle. We're not going to skip that stuff. We may not get to all of it tonight, but I think there are some things in chapter 6 that are pertinent and that are worthy of us spending a little time talking about. I've seen a couple of different methods for dividing the book of Acts up into sections, and somewhere around 5 and 6 is kind of a common point for folks to sort of mark a division. And I think I myself would put the end of chapter 5 as kind of the end of the beginning, and the beginning of chapter 6 on up through, I'm not sure where, we'll talk about it when we get there, is sort of the start of the second section. With the first 5 chapters dealing primarily with the coming of the Spirit, the beginning of the church, and sort of the early days of the church. And beginning in chapter 6, we begin to zero in on the events that lead to ultimately the church being scattered out of Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria. Okay? And so beginning with chapter 6, we start turning the ship in that direction. And by chapter 8, they're running Christians out of Jerusalem, and they're going out everywhere sharing the word. Because it's been a couple of weeks since we've met together, and because I think it's helpful for some of the things that I want to talk about in chapter 6, I'd like for us to spend a few minutes thinking about the church that's described in the first 5 chapters of Acts. And if you were to describe or to talk about what the church was like in its early days, and specifically I'm thinking about these first 5 chapters, how would you describe it? What kinds of things would you say about it? I'm wanting adjectives, sentences, anything that comes to mind when you think about the beginning of the church and the church in its early days there in Jerusalem. Start with Zoe and then to Mike.
I would say connected came to my mind.
Okay, connected. Mm-hmm. Okay. Certainly as we end chapter 5 and they've gone through a pretty significant bout of persecution. that rather than them running off and hiding or secluding themselves, they're staying connected with each other, but they're also staying connected and talking about to anybody that'll listen the things that they believe.
Yeah, and I think sharing, it says they had all things in common. And then
Okay.
when we talked about Ananias and Sapphira before, the issue was they didn't have to give, but they said they gave. So,
Okay.
they were sharing all things in common, but they weren't being required to do it, but they were doing it.
Okay. There were lots of sort of extraordinary things that happened that led to a fear, a respect for God and what he was doing with the church and how things had set up, events that certainly cemented the authority and the legitimacy of the message and all those kinds of things going on that I think served to help focus them as well. What was the church made up of? Who was in the church?
Mostly converted Jews.
Well, in one sense, all kinds of people. Okay, but in another sense, only one kind of person. Okay, basically Jews. Okay, started in Jerusalem. The message was not being preached to Gentiles. We're going to read tonight about, one of the 7 that gets selected is actually a Gentile who is a proselyte, someone who converted to Judaism. But they're the only Gentiles that have anything to do with what's going on so far. And there is a very specific focus, and it's deliberate. It's what the apostles were instructed to do by Jesus and by the Spirit, is you're going to start in Jerusalem, and then we're going to go out. So there was that in one sense, there was kind of a homogeneous kind of group, but they weren't all Jews from Jerusalem. Where else had they come from? Okay, Greece, or from Greek-influenced cities. If you'll recall, when we talked about the day of Pentecost, that folks had come from all over the known world for the Passover, and many of them had stuck around for the Passover, or for Pentecost, and were there when Peter preached. They were witnesses of the crucifixion. They knew and had heard all the things that had gone on. But they were literally from a whole variety of cities, from cities that were essentially free but under Roman rule, self-governed. There were others from cities that actually were Roman outposts. And so you had, even within sort of the single group that they were, you had folks from a lot of different places. Which is important, and I think begins to play out as we start here in chapter 6. Any other thoughts about what the church was like? Matt?
They were meeting with daily frequency.
Okay. And not because the apostles were pounding on them saying you got to. I mean, they were doing life together. We've been using that phrase a lot around here. They certainly were. They were doing life together, but for many of them it was a different life because they hadn't gone back home yet. They were someplace and probably didn't expect that it was going to be that way. Yeah, Charlene.
Just to reflect back on Ananias and Sapphira, it just shows that even though everything was going great at the beginning,
Okay.
there was still humanity and weaknesses, and those were just pointed out in those 2 areas, but everyone had them.
Okay. And that's a perfect segue into chapter 6. Okay, let's read the first 7 verses of chapter 6. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. Let's stop right there. I was going to read all 7, but let's start right there. Let's unpack this. This is the early church. They're arguing with each other. I didn't think they did that sort of stuff. Okay, these are people like us, and we've talked about this in previous classes that, you know, and I always want to caveat this because I never want to undermine the commitment and the sacrifice, and in some cases, sacrifice of their lives that the early Christians went through. I never want to underplay that, but by the same token, they were folks like us. They were tempted like us. They had interrelationship issues with each other. They had sins. They had all the kinds of things that we deal with, and you know, they weren't immune from temptation. And so in this case, you've got some Hebraic Jews, which are primarily those from in and around fairly close to Jerusalem, and you've got your Grecian Jews who have come from the other cities, and they're not getting along. Why wouldn't they get along?
Speak different languages.
Okay. All right. They're probably all speaking Aramaic. Okay. All right. So there's maybe not that big of a language barrier, but in some cases might in fact be there. If you are a Jew who is living in Jerusalem and you've grown up going to the temple all your life, and know some of the priests, and you know your family has done this and your family has done that, and you're thrown in with a bunch of folks who've been living out with the heathens in the outer reaches, I think there's something about human nature that would make it easy for folks maybe to feel a little superior to others. And particularly when you throw on top of that the way that outside of Christianity, the way that Jews generally felt about Greek culture and Gentiles, we can't even hardly imagine, in many cases, how much the Jews look down on the Gentiles. Now, these are Jews, but they're living in Gentile culture and bringing, I'm sure, some of the baggage with them. One of Israel's big problems was not correctly understanding what it meant to be God's chosen people. In that we're special because, you know, God has chosen us because we're special, not in spite of who we are. And so there was a general disdain for anybody or anything that didn't conform to sort of the strict Jewish protocol and ways of doing things. And there was a wide range. At the very least, it was we're the chosen ones, and someday everybody who is not a Jew is going to be serving us. Okay, that's on the good end. On the bad end was the attitude that, well, after all, Gentiles have only been created to be the fuel for hell. Okay? And so you had all of those kinds of things, and you had a mix of people who were coming, who lived in those cultures, who probably brought some habits and some, you know, and just you're from out of town, and your accent is different, and the language that you're speaking, there's a little bit different there. And so it resulted in some favoritism being shown. And here, Luke doesn't, the way that Luke states it, it's not like the Grecian Jews thought that their widows were being overlooked in the Jewish region. It was happening. Okay, it was a problem. Okay. Take a little sidestep here. is one of the things maybe that we sort of take for granted is the Judeo-Christian tradition and actual history of taking care of the unfortunate. We don't, many times, because we've grown up around lots of charities, lots of foundations, lots of boards, lots of programs that seek to help those who are unfortunate, we don't realize how much of that came out of the Hebrews. There's an interesting book, if you like reading books on history, there's a guy by the name of Cahill who wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews. He's got a lot of wacky theology, okay? He's got some pretty liberal theology in there, but when you wade through that stuff and you get into the case that he makes for what the concept of there being a one all-knowing God who cares about his creation and the impact that that has on everything else and how it wasn't anywhere else in the world until the Hebrews. This idea that they were even taking care of the widows actually goes back to some common practices in Jerusalem at this time where there was daily distribution of food to widows and collections for those who were unfortunate to help them out. And clearly I think the Christians kept doing some of those things, and they were taking care of those who needed to be taken care of. I think there's benefit in us appreciating that and in realizing that the thing, even in our particular day and time and culture, the things that are happening by boards and foundations and groups that in some cases go out of their way to divorce themselves from any religious context, they really owe a lot to the tradition and the history and the foundation that was laid by a mindset that we're all created by God and we need to take care of each other. And there's some benefit in meditating on that a little bit and appreciating that. So at any rate, this, yes, Rodney? Hang on just a second. You're going to go live on air.
You mentioned how the concept of there being only one God and such, it kind of originated with Hebrews. I don't believe that Abraham and his descendants invented a new religion, but somehow it got passed down from the first man, Adam, down through Noah and so forth. And somehow it got passed down almost like a remnant, so to speak. Somehow it got passed down, but there wasn't any major group that this nation or this group was doing it.
Yeah. I certainly don't think Abraham invented one God. I think God revealed himself to him. And so that's another class. That's the Genesis class, okay? But thank you for that. That's a good point. So we got this problem. We've got some natural human nature in the church that's impacting relationships, impacting behavior. And so let's look what they do about it. Verse 2. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We'll turn this responsibility over to them, and we'll give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the Word." Are the 12 saying they're too good to wait on tables? No. They're not saying that.
They're recognizing where their priority
Okay.
lies.
All right. What do you think about their approach to the solution here? What do they not do? Maybe as a way to get to what I'm thinking about. Okay, they didn't choose them themselves. They didn't point fingers. They basically didn't go in and dictate, okay, here's what you are going to do. Okay? You know, you guys, you're getting off track and you're wrong, and so you're going to do that and you're going to do that. So they called everybody together and talked about it. They called them all together and they said, look, we got a situation we need to deal with. It's not dictatorial, but it's a group activity. But the apostles keeping a clear vision on what the Spirit has called them to do and what Jesus commissioned them to do. So, you know, we've got this mission, but we have also got this very real situation that we need to take care of. You know, they didn't try to deny it. They didn't try to say, look, you guys are just getting in the way of the ministry. You guys just go off and figure this out and get out. None of that. It's, let's do this. And so let's pick some guys. What kind of guys did they pick? Find for you 7 guys who have restaurant experience. Find 7 guys maybe who have worked for a caterer before. No, find 7 guys who are what? Full of Spirit. Okay. You know, we could go off on a tangent here. There is something to be said for in the church when you're trying to solve a problem or deal with a situation, don't just go for the worldly characteristic of leadership. Go for the spiritual person. Okay. And so they select these guys. Let's look at who some of these guys are. This proposal, verse 5, pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. Also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, a convert to Judaism. They presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. Who are these guys? They're faithful men. Okay. Anybody in here speak Greek? None of these names are Hebrew names. Okay. They're all Greek names. So they have selected guys from the Grecian Jew group to see that the problem is taken care of. And one of them's even a Gentile. The last one, he's a convert. So they selected those guys, which says something about the way in which the folks of different backgrounds within the church ought to be perceiving each other. That there should not be 2 classes of Christians. Okay. And selected from the group that might otherwise be looked down on a little bit, and the apostles call them up and lay their hands on them and make it clear that these are the guys that are going to deal with this issue. Some good, sound, I think, decision making going on here. Obviously, the Spirit is helping out. And so they lay their hands on them and say, we're going to devote ourselves, this will allow us to keep doing the things that we've been charged with doing. And the result of it, yes, Rodney?
It does, there was already a daily distribution going on.
Yes.
And it was only the Greeks that were being neglected. So apparently the Jews that were in need were already getting help.
Okay.
So I think that's, and which also implies to me that there was somebody doing that work already.
Yep.
So that's probably why everyone that was appointed at this time were Greeks, because they would be more sympathetic to an understanding of the needs of that group of people. And there was already a group that was handling it for
Yeah. Which means that group was going to have to submit a little bit.
Yeah.
and change their ways some.
And for you mean there were other deacons? Well, the literal meaning of deacon is just a servant, and yeah, there were servants.
Yeah. Okay. Result of this in verse 7 is, so the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. This is maybe my favorite verse in the entire book of Acts. One is, they had a problem, they came together, they came up with a good solution, and the result was not only that things didn't slow down, but almost sounded like things sped up. Okay. We read a few chapters ago that the number of men were 5,000. So we're dealing with a good-sized group of folks, and I'm sure a daily distribution of food and a task and a problem that was larger than, 2 or 3 folks over here on the side, not getting what they were supposed to get. But then it ends with this phrase that a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Why do you suppose that was?
I thought that was there to show, one, how much progress there's making,
Okay.
but it also kind of leads to now the next section. And I was reading through Acts one time and realized, not too long ago, the apostles were arrested, but Gamaliel, or however you pronounce his name, spoke up for him and they let him go. Here, they're now more afraid of losing their power after that, and so they start escalating things because the priests are even turning.
Okay. All right, we're going to circle back to that in just a minute. I think you're right on point, is the opposition hasn't gone away. The folks who threaten the disciples, or the apostles, that don't you keep teaching this guy's name, we're going to beat them, they haven't gone away, but yet there are now priests who are becoming believers. And I love this verse being here because if you're like me, you read through the Gospels and you see all of the things that happened relative to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion and resurrection, the things that happened from the darkness for 3 hours in the middle of the day, from the reports of people walking around out of the tombs, to the body's gone. He ain't there. The tomb is empty. All of those kinds of things. And you've got this group of folks who are as knowledgeable of the law and the prophets as anybody should have been. Don't some of them see that? And so I think there's been this period of time, and we'll talk about the period of time in just a minute, where there have been these folks that have seen this, who are torn between the establishment and those folks who insist that this can't be right, but look at what Jesus did. I saw him heal that guy. I saw Peter and John heal that cripple. I remember when the curtain, and I don't know if you realize this or not, but the curtain in the temple that ripped from top to bottom, somebody talked about it in communion just a few weeks ago. But I looked it up. The size of that curtain was about the width of that recess and about 10 feet taller than that. That's the curtain that ripped in two. And how thick it was. It was something like 6 inches thick or something like that. This was not, it got old, and fell apart. This was concurrent with Jesus' death, and that, access to God is now possible. These guys had to have seen that. And so now we see some of them becoming Christians.
I had kind of forgotten about during that whole time frame that many of the dead were seen walking around Jerusalem. perhaps some of these priests were, a part of that or, witnessed that. But I had a little note to myself here from going through this years ago that with the Jerusalem temple, these priests would have most likely had to cease being a priest to be a disciple. Yeah. And that's more than just the family societal ostracism that Christians were facing being a Jew and deciding to be a Christian. While that is difficult, I can't imagine what this next layer was like for a priest. Now what?
Right.
Like, I am not a carpenter, I am not a baker, I'm a priest, and what's a large number? You hear different things even throughout this opening 6 chapters in Acts of numbers and descriptions of stuff where people are either numbered or whatever. What's a large number? I mean, that's, to me, it's surprising and a bit shocking that would happen in Jerusalem. This wasn't way out in Thessalonica somewhere, or, some outpost of Jewishness. I mean, this is it.
Yeah.
And then these priests are becoming disciples. I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
Okay. So circling back around, and I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on your name back here. Brooks. Thank you, Brooks. Back to what you were saying, is as we move into Stephen and his arrest, this factor is playing into it. Is we've got a church that, in spite of opposition, in spite of efforts to squelch it, is growing even more rapidly, and now some of the priests. Okay, so when you get up to the very upper echelon of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the high priest family that is still probably the same one who said it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation, these guys are being pushed to a point where we've got to do something. And that's sort of the atmosphere and the environment that we have happening in Jerusalem at that time. Ronnie?
Yeah, it seems very clear to me that it's just really the Holy Spirit working, and the power is being revealed, and men are responding accordingly.
Yeah. But I love that. I don't. It's only been a few years ago that I ever noticed that verse. A number of times I read through there and just never noticed, and didn't think about what the impact of that was. But it's kind of become my favorite verse in Acts. So yes. So.
I was just going to say, I think, too, many of those priests had to have had a very sincere faith. They had to have had something within them that allowed them to serve in the way that they did.
Right.
And I know when you work for a place and then you see an excitement that comes in, somebody comes in with a new idea, and you feel in your heart that it's right. This is what we've been missing. So some of the stuff that's being done at this point by these early deacons, might just, ring a bell of clarity with the priest to say, this is what we should have been doing all along. So I love the thought that they jumped on the bandwagon, willing to give up their position because the sincerity of their heart said, this is where I need to be. So to me, that's truly exciting.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think at the very upper echelon, there was tremendous amount of corruption. Okay, but I think when you get down into the body of priests, and we're talking thousands of priests, really, in terms of those that were providing the services at the temple. So we could be talking about several hundred, to try to put a number on it. I'm guessing. But when you look at all the things that had to take place at the temple and how that they were sectioned and assigned and routed in, you're talking thousands of priests. And at the very top, it was as corrupt as it could be. but down where Zoe's talking about, there were priests there that were serious about what they were doing, and they saw what was happening, and they recognized it. Maybe this guy really was the Messiah. I mean, and I can't deny what I've seen. So Stephen, let's read about Stephen, verse 8. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. Let's stop right there. Here's something that we're going to see throughout the book of Acts and really consistent on into the epistles and the rest of the New Testament. We've already seen on 2 or 3 different occasions Acts talk about the signs and the wonders that the apostles did. And I think we talked about one a couple of weeks ago where it was specific that it was just the apostles doing it and not everybody else. And we talked about that at the time. Here we have, I think, maybe the first instance of someone who is not an apostle doing signs and wonders. Notice that there is a direct reference to the apostles having laid their hands on him. If you continue to look through and we'll probably point it out every time we see it as we go through Acts, I don't know of a verse anywhere in the New Testament that talks about specifically somebody doing these kinds of things, that there's not a direct reference and a way to trace back to the fact that the apostles had laid their hands on them. And it goes back to the discussion we had, 6 weeks ago about how that the power of the Spirit is for confirming the Word. It's not for confirming your spirituality. It's not something selfish for you to have so that you feel good about yourself and you know you're right with God, which is unfortunately the focus so much of the Spirit today when people talk about it. And my position is, unless you can find me an apostle that's still alive, that's laid hands on you, you may be doing stuff, but I don't think it's from the Spirit. Okay? And again, I'm open if somebody wants to show me the verse and show me the passage where somebody had the ability to do that without the laying on of hands of the apostles. I'm open to it, but I ain't found it yet. So, in passing. All right. So, Stephen begins to distinguish himself even among the 7, not because he's so great at waiting on tables, which he is, okay. I'm sure he's doing his job, but his spirituality distinguishes himself in the ways that he's teaching, and the Spirit starts working through him. And so it says that in verse 9, opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexander, as well as the prophets of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Spirit by whom he spoke. Okay, these are Grecian Jews who are opposing him. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, we've heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God. So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, this fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. But we've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. And all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of the angel. Okay, we're already in this environment where there is a significant faction of folks who don't want to give up the law of Moses. Okay. And so when Stephen starts becoming effective in proclaiming the Messiah, there's the opposition that's been fomenting there bubbles up. What do they accuse him of? What is Stephen accused of? Okay, blasphemy, which under the law carried what kind of penalty? Okay, stoning, which legally Jews didn't have the right to do. Okay, throw that in there. You know, that's why they drug Jesus over to Pilate. But they bring him before the Sanhedrin. If you go back and look at the other times when the apostles have been brought before folks and threatened, the first time Peter and John are brought before the Sanhedrin. They're there before the high priests, mostly Sadducees made up the Sanhedrin, but you also had some teachers of the law and Pharisees there. Their Supreme Court, very formal setting. The second time, when they're drug in front of folks and they're beaten, doesn't say it's the Sanhedrin. It just says it's some of the leaders, okay? Some of the teachers of the law and the Sadducees and whatever. Now we're back to a formal hearing. We're back. This is a formal this is formal accusation, formal court kind of situation. And these guys have to pay people to make up stories. Okay. And so what do they accuse him? What is the blasphemy that they accuse him of? Okay, all right. Okay, it's against Moses. Okay.
The holy place, the temple,
You're going to tear the temple down. What does that remind you of? Okay, didn't in fact Jesus talk about, you tear this place down, 3 days later I'll raise it up? They didn't realize he was talking about the resurrection. Okay, so they could, bring that in, I'm sure. What did they not say? Yeah, what did they not accuse him of?
Well, it reads like a parallel of Jesus being called before the court. So they didn't accuse him of calling himself God.
Okay.
Although he was doing miraculous signs and things like that.
Okay.
So they could have.
They didn't say his signs were false. This guy's out here tricking the people and doing things that are false. Didn't bring that up at all. They didn't bring up the resurrection at all. Okay? They try to bring in time to, he's teaching what that Jesus guy did, about tearing down things. But they don't dare go to, this guy that you killed and we know is dead. Because the tomb's empty, guys. They can't deny that. So they have to come back around the corner to find something else. And so there's Stephen sitting there. What does it mean, as we close out here for tonight, that his face looked like an angel? What is?
Always thought it was like he said in Jesus.
Okay. Any other thoughts about what that phrase means?
I just always thought it meant glowing or
Okay.
very content or something.
Okay.
Glowing or content.
All right, glowing or content. Yeah, I always wonder, is there some kind of aura, is he like some of those Renaissance paintings, where he's got this thing around it? I don't think that was it, okay?
Like reflection of the Spirit.
Okay, reflection of the Spirit?
He was not stressing over anything.
Okay, to me, I think that's getting close to it. He's not there chomping at the bit wanting to argue with them. I mean, he's going to let them have it. Next week we're going to read about him, by the end of his defense, he unloads both barrels on them. But he's not stressing, okay? It's not, maybe I'm going to get in trouble. Maybe these guys are going to do something to me. It's, I'm here. Spirit's going to use me the way that the Spirit's going to use me. I know what I believe. I know what I know. let these guys take their best shot. Okay, and so I think there was a calmness, there was a not, every time if you're like me, when somebody disagrees with you and they start talking, it's like you want to interrupt them and you want to jump in and you want, and you're like this the whole time. None of that kind of stuff. He's also perhaps knows he's in a court situation and that he's going to get his turn to present. And man, the Spirit's going to do something here. And so he's just waiting and he's ready for that to happen. What I'd like for you to do next week is, in almost every Acts class and every sermon that I've ever heard on Stephen, they don't read his defense. They'll read the beginning of it, and they'll make some reference to what he's doing, and they'll jump down immediately to where he unloads on them and into the stoning. I want us to read through his defense. And so I'd like for you to read through that. Think about the similarities between what Stephen says here and Peter's sermon back in Acts chapter 2. There are some, and again, I think it's Acts chapter 4 where we have another sermon. There are some commonalities and some continuing themes that keep arising in these messages. And I think they're important messages for us as well as we think about the kind of message and the way that we share with folks. Certainly there are some differences in terms of heritage and past history of folks that we talk to versus the audiences here. But I think there's some commonality in the messages that are instructive for us. So appreciate your comments. We got through a whole chapter tonight. We'll try to do that again next week. Let's pray as we close. God, we thank you for your word, and as we look at it, we learn about you, we learn about your Son and the Spirit. And in this study, we're learning and coming to understand more about your early church, the church that you established, the church that is the bride of Jesus. And as we look at them, in some ways, we marvel at the bravery and the courage and the things that they were willing to go through for the sake of your name. But we also recognize that they're folks like us, and we take encouragement from the fact that they did the things that they did and were led by you, but we're still folks like us. Pray that we can take courage from that. Help us not use it as an excuse to be weak, but rather as a call to courage and bravery and patience and perseverance. I pray that you will bless this church, the part of your church that meets here. Help us to grow in love towards each other. Help us to not be in situations where folks are not being taken care of. Help us to understand the commonality and the brotherhood that we have, that we're one in Christ, that we've all been saved and redeemed by His blood. God, be with us as we travel from here tonight. Take us home safely and give us good rest. Be with those that I know would like to be here tonight but are unable. We think of Gary and Bert and Renee and others, Casma, Irene. God, bless their health. Get them well and get them where they can be back with us soon. We miss them. Help them to know and feel the concern and the love that we have for them. God, thank you for your Son and for the redemption, for the forgiveness that we have, and that we can come to you and pray in His name now. Amen.